They came without rifles, without shields, without a single defense protocol active. Just human soldiers exhausted, hollowed out, carrying the weight of their fallen across the jagged, blood-stained ground of a neutral moon called Kairos 8. The ceasefire had been signed only hours before, a fragile, desperate pause in a conflict that had already claimed too many. Both sides were granted the right to collect and bury their dead. Nothing more. No weapons drawn, no eyes locked in challenge, only silence and solemnity. And the humans obeyed that rule to the letter. They didn't march in formation. They didn't look for targets. They moved with reverence. Each body they carried had a name, a voice, a memory that hadn't faded yet. There were no drums, no speeches, just soft soil being turned by gloved hands, and one squad after another lowering the lost into the planet's frostbitten dirt. But they weren't alone, not for long. The sky buzzed with the shriek of Dominion scout gliders. Then came the footfalls he calculated, mechanical, dozens of armored boots crunching into brittle rock. Alien commanders stood in perfect formation, looking down at the humans from a ridge like spectators at a pit match. Their armor glinted with ceremonial chrome. Their weapons were holstered but visible. The humans kept digging. One soldier, a young lieutenant with burn scars across his jaw, paused just long enough to glance up at the aliens. But his superior placed a hand on his shoulder and shook his head. Stay focused, finish the work, honor them. That's all that mattered. But the aliens weren't there to witness honor. They were there for humiliation. It began with a wisp of crackled laughter through their comms. Then it got louder, audible. The Dominion's second in command, an old warlord with red-washed tusks and a voice like gravel through oil, began to mock the humans in his native tongue. They broadcast his commentary across open channels. The translations followed. "Look how carefully they bury their dead," he said, "as if that will stop them from dying again tomorrow." One of his aides mimed a human funeral rite kneeling with exaggerated sorrow, slapping his own face in a twisted parody of grief. Another tossed a canister into one of the half-dug graves, laughing. The human soldiers didn't respond, but their eyes changed. Some froze, spade mid-motion. Some clenched fists but didn't move. The mood had shifted, but the duty remained. The burial had to continue. They couldn't stop, not even for this. And that's when the Dominion did the unthinkable. Without warning, a single Dominion rifle was raised. One shot. One soldier collapsed forward into the very grave he'd just finished digging. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. A clean, center mass kill delivered in the middle of a ceasefire, during a funeral, in front of unarmed men and women. The humans didn't scatter. They didn't scream. They didn't retaliate. They stood frozen in grief that suddenly had nowhere to go. One soldier dropped to her knees, hands trembling. Another gently rolled the fallen man over, closed his eyes, and without a word, began shoveling dirt over him. The others followed, in silence. No defiance, no surrender, just an unbearable kind of reverence, the kind that cuts deeper than vengeance ever could. The Dominion laughed harder. The commander gestured mockingly to the humans, as if asking, "How many more do you want to bury?" And still, Earth didn't answer. That was the last message the galaxy received from human military channels for 36 hours. No press release, no threat, just complete silence. Fleets vanished from their patrol zones. Embassies darkened their windows. Civilian relays reported drops in traffic from human systems. The silence wasn't empty. It was loaded, calculated, terrifying. Because Earth didn't scream when it hurt. It planned. It logged every name of every soldier that had been mocked, humiliated, murdered while grieving. It mapped every Dominion asset within 3 jumps of Kairos 8. It unlocked contingency code bases buried for decades. And in that silence, something colder than war began to rise. Not revenge, not rage, something simpler, something absolute. The aliens had laughed when we buried our dead. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, is that humans never bury the fallen to forget. We bury them to make room for what's coming next. And this time, there will be no laughter left. She wasn't supposed to matter. Not to them. Not in any strategic sense. To the Dominion High Command, she was a low-priority target, an unarmed civilian specialist, attached to a diplomatic medical corps, with no battlefield relevance. But what they failed to calculate, what they always fail to calculate, was that humanity's strength was never just in its ships or soldiers, it was in the ones who chose to show up without a weapon. Her name was Lieutenant Elena Rowe, young, quiet, a second-generation peace envoy assigned to Cairo's 8 to oversee medical recovery efforts during ceasefire observance. On paper, she was just a field analyst with triage clearance, but to the soldiers burying their dead that day, she was the reason they were still alive. She'd dragged a captain through fire while under drone bombardment. She'd stabilized a Dominion prisoner who'd later testify against his own warlord. She treated every wounded person the Samia with steady hands and a voice that never trembled, not even when death hovered inches from her neck. And somehow, without trying, she had become more than a medic. She had become the thread holding something sacred together in a war that had unraveled everything else. Her presence at the burial wasn't political. It was personal. She'd insisted on being there, even though the delegation tried to stop her. "You've done enough," they said, but she hadn't a nod to her. She knew the names of every soldier they buried that day, knew which ones had kids, knew which ones had left messages unopened. She walked among the coffins like a sister among brothers, placing one gloved hand on each body before it was lowered, whispering something only she and the dead could hear. The troops watched her, and not out of protocol, but because her presence made the burial feel real, like someone still remembered who they were before this war turned everything to ash. She had no medals, no command, just the kind of quiet authority that can't be taught, only earned in the dark when no one's watching. But the Dominion was watching, and they saw it differently. They didn't see a medic offering dignity. They saw weakness, softness, a liability to control. Their soldiers whispered her name with contempt, calling her the White Ghost, as if compassion were something alien to be feared. To them, she represented a flaw in humanity's armor, or as something that could be punctured, erased. So when they opened fire during the funeral, she was the first to fall. No warning, no hesitation. One shot to the chest, center mass. Her body crumpled beside the grave of a soldier she'd treated weeks earlier, the same soldier whose life she had extended by just enough to allow his family to say goodbye. She died with her hands still open, not reaching for help, reaching to finish what she'd started. The Dominion sniper didn't even flinch. What they didn't realize, not in that moment, was that her death detonated something far larger than a strategic command center ever could. Because you can bomb a fleet, and the world will rebuild it. But when you kill a symbol, or when you silence the one person everyone believed was still good, you light a fire that spreads without orders. Across every squad she had touched, across every wounded soldier she'd kept alive, something cracked, not broken, hardened. Every man and woman at that burial stopped being a survivor. They became something else, something the Dominion hadn't faced before. Because Elena wasn't just a daughter, or a medic, or a name on a personnel log. She was the reason they still believed in restraint. And now that she was gone, they stopped holding back. No signal was given, no official retaliation launched. But in the days that followed, Dominion scout patrols began to vanish cleanly, quietly, without evidence. Medical relief stations that had once cooperated across factions suddenly sealed their borders. Black box transmissions started ending with a phrase no one had used in a decade: for the fallen healer. The Dominion assumed it was just emotional fallout. But those who knew her, who fought beside her, didn't cry. They recalibrated. They stopped asking whether Earth would respond. Because Elena Rowe wasn't just mourned, she was avenged. One mission at a time, one system at a time, until her name became a warning, whispered across the stars: you don't touch the ones who bury our dead. And you never, ever shoot the one who stayed behind to help. The Dominion didn't need a reason. That was the terrifying part. No tactical advantage, no defense necessity, no warning shot. They had everything they wanted: already secured ground, a ceasefire treaty, the upper hand in negotiation optics. And still, they pulled the trigger. Because it wasn't about war anymore. It was about the message, a performance designed not to claim victory, but to humiliate. They were the Helvetii overseers, the kind bred for conquest and raised on cruelty, believed in psychological dominance above all. They saw dignity as a virus, weakness dressed in moral disguise. So when they caught wind of the funeral arrangements on Cairo's 8, when they heard that human soldiers would pause the war to bury their own under a neutral flag, unarmed and exposed, They saw an opportunity too tempting to ignore. That's when they launched what they called Operation Hollow Kneel. It wasn't a military strike. It was theater, carefully orchestrated, timed to coincide with the moment the final human coffin was to be lowered. Dominion scouts had embedded cloaked drones into the sky long before the funeral began. They wanted it all recorded, every bowed head, every spoken name, every tear not wiped away. They wanted the galaxy to see humanity broken, reverent, restrained, and then they wanted to burn it down on camera. The shot that triggered the slaughter didn't come from panic. It came from calculation. A single, sanctioned order sent from a Dominion war barge orbiting low, relayed to a rifle squad hidden behind optical scramblers. Fire at will. No resistance was expected. The first casualty was the chaplain, a civilian. The second was a young corporal standing guard without a loaded weapon. By the time the third body fell, the screams had already started, and the cameras never blinked. From 27 Dominion outposts and 3 major broadcast hubs, the footage was streamed live, not hacked, not leaked, deliberately aired. The Dominion didn't just want humans to feel it. They wanted the rest of the galaxy to witness what happens when mercy is mistaken for strength. Dominion analysts even held a live panel during the massacre, narrating the attack as a symbolic surgical sweep, citing fabricated intelligence that accused the humans of using the burial as a cover for espionage. Their commentary was smug, clinical, and utterly devoid of remorse. A Helvesi tactician smirked as he dissected the scene on air. Watch their posture. The humans stand still even under fire, because somewhere in their tiny hearts, they still think honor matters. And in that moment, across space, no one spoke for Earth. No military response, no rebuttal, no diplomatic cry. Just a signal drop. Every human relay and command frequency went offline within 2 minutes of the last soldier falling. Dominion operatives interpreted that silence as weakness, a retreat, confirmation that the emotional rupture had done its job. They laughed, genuinely. In some sectors, they even celebrated. On the trade world of Juvver 9, Dominion officers toasted with red crystal liquor as the final moments of the burial ambush played on loop behind them. No empire survives by tolerating sentiment, one of them said, raising a glass. But the celebration wouldn't last, because the humans who buried their dead weren't erased. They were remembered, not just by the galaxy, but by the machines they had programmed as silent guardians deep in Earth's strategic command layers, calibrated to respond not to orders, but to injustice. Triggers tied to biometrics and battlefield conditions. No human had to say a word. No button had to be pressed. Protocols written in peacetime activated themselves. Files unlocked. Drones rerouted. Entire squadrons of orbital ships vanished from public maps and reappeared in classified ghost lanes coordinated silently through darknet algorithms only a handful of people ever knew existed. Earth didn't speak. It moved. And its first move wasn't loud. It was invisible. Back on Dominion-controlled worlds, the video footage of the one they broadcast with Pridea began disappearing from their own networks. Vanishing not just from public feeds, but from military archives. Communications officers reported entire databases scrambled, overwritten, replaced by silence. Some feeds began looping back the burial footage in reverse. Others showed a single frame, a shovel, resting beside a helmet in the dirt. Nothing more. They had mocked humanity's grief. They had televised it for sport. And now, in the silence they mistook for surrender, something ancient had awakened. Not anger, not vengeance, precision. Because Earth never forgets the ones who buried the dead, and it never forgives those who interrupt the ceremony. The last sound Earth made was a static pulse, a soft, fractured signal that echoed through the Dominion surveillance channels like the final breath of a dying star. Then came the silence, total and calculated. Earth's diplomatic lines went dark, military beacons vanished, even commercial traffic to human colonies halted mid-jump. No reroutes, no distress signals, just absence. At first, Dominion intelligence interpreted it as shock, a fractured system collapsing under the emotional weight of its own tragedy. But silence from Earth was never accidental, and it didn't come from confusion, it came from decision. In less than an hour after the funeral ambush, Every major Terran fleet left visual range. Embassies on shared worlds sealed their domes. Civilian contractors were pulled out of neutral zones with no explanation. And still a broken bar, not a word. It was not retreat. It was not delay. It was the moment the war changed species. Because humans don't scream when they're wounded, they plan. That was the part the Dominion could never calculate. They were raised in a doctrine of escalation. Show pain, scream louder, return fire immediately, dominate by noise and aggression. But humans, when they go quiet, it means they're building something. And that something always arrives colder, sharper, and far more permanent than vengeance. And so, while the Dominion celebrated, Earth disappeared from the table A and from every eye watching the conflict unfold. But not before leaving behind the one clue that only a few would understand. A protocol stamp burned into the relay logs of the last human comm burst. It read simply, Mirrorfall. To the untrained, Mirrorfall meant nothing, just a no decommission failsafe embedded into legacy defense code. But to certain strategists, the kind who'd worked black sites, the kind whose careers didn't officially exist, a Mirrorfall was a ghost protocol. It activated only under one condition: the televised, dishonorable killing of unarmed human personnel during sacred rites. Not prisoners, not combatants, civilians, medics, chaplains, the ones whose uniforms had never been stitched with weapons-grade fibers because they were never meant to be targets. The moment those soldiers were gunned down mid-funeral, Mirrorfall began rewriting Earth's war posture in real time. Artificial command loops severed diplomatic override chains. Redundant threat recognition systems began silently mapping Dominion critical infrastructure. And deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, a classified listening node untouched for 2 decades as it blinked to life for the first time since the Europa Accords. And yet a broken bar, not a single retaliation, not a single broadcast of outrage, just silence. The Dominion media played the footage on repeat, still assuming their performance had worked, that humanity had been broken, that the burial had doubled as a psychological scalpel, slicing through the last threads of Terran restraint. They thought the humans were mourning, but mourning had ended the moment the final body was lowered into the ground. What came after wasn't grief, it was momentum. And momentum, when fueled by conviction instead of chaos, is unstoppable. Dominion scouts reported eerie quiet around all Terran-controlled systems. Patrols that once buzzed with chatter now floated like ghost fleets. Terraforming operations froze mid-construction. Spaceports fell dark, save for a single signal light pulsing every 6 seconds like a heartbeat, a broken bar or a countdown. Then came the rumors. Dominion merchant vessels arriving at trade hubs missing entire cargo bays, claiming they'd passed near human systems and never seen a ship but came home with half their ship phased out of sync. Stations at the edge of Orion space began receiving strange transmission loops, soft audio recordings of burial rites being read backward, accompanied by distorted coordinates. And in the middle of it all, Earth said nothing, as if the entire planet had exhaled one final time, and was now simply waiting for someone to breathe wrong. Diplomats from smaller systems pleaded for clarity, for a response, for anything resembling the political Earth they once knew. They got none, and in that vacuum of sound, the galaxy began to fracture. Alliances strained, Dominion allies started falling silent themselves, unsure if the silence from Earth was contagious, a broken bar, or strategic. Because silence, in the right hands, is not weakness, it is permission, it is promise, it is the sound of a predator closing distance, too fast and too quiet for the prey to recognize its final mistake. And by the time the Dominion realized that silence wasn't Earth breaking a broken bar, it was Earth preparing to end something permanently. They didn't know about the codes. Not even most humans did. Not the ones walking the surface or flying the ships or reading the daily pulses of interstellar news. The ones who did know were buried deep inside Earth's defense architecture, subterranean levels beneath the Pacific Rim Command Core, where sunlight hadn't touched the walls in decades. Down there, They didn't talk in politics or treaties. They spoke in triggers, in sealed vaults and genetic encryption, in protocols designed not for retaliation, but for principle. Because Earth's military might didn't just evolve to win battles, it evolved to preserve something older, the line between war and inhumanity. That line was what Mirafall watched for, and when it snapped when the funeral was turned into a firing line, when unarmed soldiers were executed while burying their dead in a neutral zone. Mirafall didn't ask for confirmation. It moved, quietly, absolutely. The moment the first Dominion shot was fired, silent programs scattered across 23 deep nodes lit up in sequence, not with fire, with focus. They reached into logistics databases, into stealth satellite arrays, into long-abandoned black site fleets kept frozen in dead space or orbiting inert moons. One by one, they aligned. They didn't broadcast it. There were no alarms, just repurposed power cores coming online, long-dormant reactors pulsing faint blue beneath oceanic trenches, orbital mines reactivated without any commander's approval. But Mirafall was only the beginning, because what the Dominion really didn't know, what no one outside of Earth's highest clearance circle ever knew, was that the burial site wasn't just sacred ground, it was a failsafe trigger. The squad that had gathered on Kairos 8 wasn't just burying their dead, they were final witnesses, carriers of a code layered into every soldier's biosuit, a self-authenticating thread that confirmed, without ambiguity, that a line had been crossed. It was called Vox 13, the Ghost Protocol, not to launch missiles, but to activate Earth's most dangerous weapon, moral clarity. Vox 13 didn't strike first. It struck truth, the kind of truth that bypasses command structures and sends a message directly into the fabric of how humanity remembers things. It marked those who fired during the funeral and not just as enemies, but as excommunicated from civilization. From that point on, no Earth system would treat Dominion military personnel as soldiers, not as prisoners of war, not as negotiators. They were, by all accounts, erased from the rules. And Earth does not negotiate with ghosts. Even the soldiers in the field didn't know it had happened. They returned to base expecting reports, orders, maybe even apologies. Instead, they found corridors being emptied, files being sealed, entire wings of Earth Command shutting down for reconfiguration. Officers with no insignia began walking the halls, flanked by drones that bore no serial numbers. Words like containment and transition asset were whispered, then deleted. The silence wasn't just outside Earth now, it was inside it too. The kind of silence that replaces fear with readiness, that changes soldiers into instruments. Because once Vox 13 activated, the war wasn't about territory anymore, it was about closure. And for the Dominion, closure meant consequence. Their data grids started unraveling in places they didn't even know had been touched. Navigation charts subtly altered. Trade behavior shifted by fractions of a percent, just enough to cause collision risks and delays. Entire supply chains failed quietly. Drones refused to obey human-sounding voices. All of it the echo of a decision made by a protocol no one could bargain with. By the time they realized something was wrong, their systems were already lying to them. They accused each other, suspected internal betrayal. But it wasn't betrayal, it was the beginning of accountability. Because Earth's silence wasn't punishment, it was the sound of a final threshold crossed. And the Dominion didn't just cross it, they desecrated it. They didn't just kill soldiers, they killed ceremony, they killed peace, they killed the space humanity gave its enemies to prove they weren't monsters. And in doing so they made sure humanity didn't have to be merciful anymore. Now the systems have been set, the protocols are alive, and the last man who knew how to deactivate them died long before the ceasefire was even signed. The only question left isn't what Earth will do, it's how much it will erase before it speaks again. The retaliation didn't begin with fire, it began with disappearance. On the 73rd hour after the Kairos 8 massacre, a Dominion listening post known as Delta's Reach ceased broadcasting. No warning, no alarms, just a broken bar gone. The station was floating above a mining colony orbiting the gas giant Vreen, reinforced with triple-layered shielding, guarded by 20 elite sentries. It was built to withstand orbital bombardment. Yet when Dominion reinforcements arrived 12 hours later, they found no signs of battle, no hull damage, no distress signals, just cold silence. Inside the station, Everything was untouched. Terminals still powered, food half-eaten, weapons in racks. But the people gone, vanished like they'd stepped out for air and never returned. And in the center of the command deck, where the Dominion crest usually glowed in red above the console, there was something new. A symbol, a crude etching, not a threat, not a boast, just a human barrel shovel, scratched into the metal. Dominion leadership dismissed it at first. They called it psychological warfare, a scare tactic. The humans are trying to rattle us, said one commander on a public broadcast. We will not blink. But then it happened again, and again. 5 installations in total, all gone in the same way. No sounds, no weapons discharged, no survivors. The galaxy had seen many kinds of warfare: bombardments, virus drones, gravity field disruptions, but this was different. This was surgical, clean, and deeply unsettling. These weren't just attacks, they were erasures, and they were happening far beyond human control territory. That was the part that made even the war-hardened Dominion strategists go quiet in their war rooms. The implication was clear: Earth wasn't launching an invasion, it was launching consequences. Inside the Dominion's elite war council, fear crept in behind the pride. They replayed the Kairos 8 footage not with glee now, but dread. They began to realize what they had triggered: not a conventional counteroffensive, but something far older, more personal. It wasn't retribution, it was a ritual, a methodical, calculated expression of pain, sealed in protocol and sharpened by patience. The squads responsible weren't listed in any known human military database. No names, no ranks, no transmissions. They didn't ask for targets, they just chose them. The only thing consistent was what they left behind: the one symbol, one idea: you mocked how we bury our dead, now watch how we bury you. And they didn't kill civilians, didn't touch colonies. Every strike was aimed at those who had watched the burial of Broken Bar and laughed. The Dominion tried to respond. Patrols were increased, trap fleets deployed. They even planned to falsely broadcasting a mock execution to draw the Retaliation units out. It failed. The station they used was later found stripped of all Dominion personnel, with the same crude etching burned into its floor. Only this time, next to it lay a single Dominion standard folded neatly beside an empty rifle. They weren't just being punished, they were being taught. Line by line, station by station, Earth was rewriting the Dominion's definition of war. And they were doing it without speeches, without propaganda, just actions, final, efficient, and always silent. Soon, the galaxy began watching again, not out of morbid curiosity like before, but awe. The same neutral systems that had shared Dominion footage days ago now refused to rebroadcast their feeds. Civilian networks pulled clips from the funeral massacre off their servers. Broadcasters who had mocked the humans in jest now offered silent moments during their shows. Even Dominion-aligned colonies began asking questions, because what started as human grief had evolved into something impossible to ignore, something terrifying in its precision, something unkillable in its resolve. And in that silence, a new language emerged, one not spoken, but felt, a language where every erased outpost, every empty station, every quiet battlefield whispered the same message: you thought we buried the weak. You were wrong, because Earth had never buried weakness, they had buried honor. And now, in their quiet, they were teaching the galaxy what happens when you mistake restraint for fragility. And the scariest part, no one knew how many of these retaliation teams existed. No one had ever seen their faces, and there was no Sigma Broken Bar that they were planning to stop. They studied humanity, or at least they thought they did. Dozens of Dominion war colleges had entire departments dedicated to human behavior analysis. They watched the old Earth wars, cataloged every Terran political collapse, measured average civilian morale based on entertainment trends, birth rates, even coffee consumption. They built their playbook on the idea that humans were emotionally reactive creatures, brave in small groups, but prone to breaking when exposed to consistent psychological pressure. And when they witnessed the funeral at Kairos 8, their analysts saw it as confirmation. The mourning, the open display of the vulnerability, the refusal to retaliate on the spot, every piece of it looked like fragility dressed in discipline. They wear restraint like armor, one Dominion strategist said, but underneath it, They're still flesh, still breakable. That sentiment echoed through the war chambers in the hours after the massacre. Earth had gone silent, yes, but to them, it was silence born from pain, not purpose. They believed it was a retreat into grief, a delay, a collapse waiting to finish itself. Dominion media showed endless loops of the burial-turned bloodbath, presenting it not just as victory, but as proof of superiority. Let the galaxy see, they said, let them witness the end of the human myth. What they didn't understand was that humanity's silence wasn't the signal of fracture, it was focus. Earth wasn't hiding from grief, it was building something with it, channeling it. The Dominion believed that by killing unarmed soldiers, by desecrating a funeral, they had broken the spirit of a war-weary species. But what they'd actually done was give Earth the one thing it had been missing since the war began: clarity. All the moral uncertainty, all the red tape, all the protocols that demanded restraint even in the face of escalating aggression, those were gone now, erased not by votes or laws, but by blood in sacred soil. And what took their place wasn't chaos, it was calculation. Dominion leaders expected riots. Instead, they got precision. They expected screams. Instead, they got disappearance. They thought Earth would lash out blindly, but Earth moved like a shadow with perfect memory. Their entire understanding of humanity had been built on incomplete data. They measured war by body count, not by resolve. They saw honor as posturing, empathy as a strategic flaw. And now, their algorithms couldn't explain why stations were going dark with no signs of conflict, why entire fleets were abandoning their patrols, why even neutral systems were beginning to sever ties with the Dominion, and not for profit or politics, but out of quiet horror. What the Dominion forgot, what they never truly grasped, is that humans don't just fight for territory, they fight for the ones who can't fight back. And when you kill those people, the medics, the chaplains, the grieving soldiers, so you don't weaken humanity, you forge its vengeance into something colder than war, something far more patient, and something that no model can predict. Because humans don't break when you hit their armies, they break when you violate their values. And once those values are gone, so are your rules of engagement. No more diplomacy, no more ceasefires, no more predictable patterns, only memory. And every erased Dominion outpost was a memory being paid forward. Some Dominion scientists began to see the truth too late. We made a critical mistake, one admitted in a confidential log later leaked by a defector. We thought grief made them vulnerable, but grief made them focused. It unified their military mind into something we can't track. That recording would never reach the Dominion Senate. The scientist vanished before it could be delivered. His ship, according to salvagers, was found drifting near a dead satellite field, with no crew and one strange anomaly. The message had been deleted, but the timestamp of the deletion matched exactly with the Earth's silence trigger. So the Dominion reran the simulations. They fed the new data into their models, and this time, the prediction came back blank. No future scenarios, no winning paths, just a question blinking on the screen. What happens when your enemy stops needing to win? Because Earth wasn't fighting for territory anymore, it was fighting to make sure no one ever laughed at its dead again. And it had already decided to broken bar no one would ever speak over a human burial twice. At first, she was just a name in the casualty report, one among many. Lieutenant Kali Riv, medical officer, field responder, age 26, killed during the funeral assault on Cairo's aide. No rank high enough to warrant immediate retaliation, no special title in the official command chain, just another body buried in silence. But when Earth's silence deepened and protocols began firing on their own, someone took a closer look. Her personnel file was unusually restricted for medic, layers of encryption stacked over even basic service records. She had never received public commendations, but her assignment logs were filled with anomaly acid-attached duty orders routed directly from Fleet Command, missions where she had no official jurisdiction but somehow always had clearance. A few officers who knew her in passing said she moved differently, a quiet but alert, as if constantly waiting for something to start. But none of that mattered to the Dominion. To them, she was a soft target, a bystander. They didn't know her lineage. They didn't know that she wasn't just a medic. She was the daughter of Admiral Sarek Ravina, the architect of Earth's outer defense net, and the man whose name had been scrubbed from all visible military history after what happened during the Deimos break. The day Collier fell, he was in isolation, not for illness, for control. A man like him couldn't be allowed near triggers during diplomatic volatility. Too dangerous, too tactical, too willing to choose the long-term cost over the short-term peace. But he had one weakness, and the Dominion found it: his daughter. Not even Earth's deepest security protocols could stop what came next, because 26 minutes after her death was confirmed by biometric signal loss, something inside Earth's legacy systems unlocked. It wasn't broadcast, it wasn't voted on, it was pre-approved decades ago under Emergency Doctrine 6R, Bloodline Failover Authorization, a last resort mechanism that granted retaliatory autonomy not to a general, or a council, but to a dead woman's blood. Embedded deep inside her was a key quantum-seeded code linked to her father's military contingency archive. Her death didn't just trigger grief, it triggered reactivation. Admiral Riven didn't ask for permission, he didn't need it. When his daughter's biosignal flatlined, it authorized him to bypass Earth Command's current leadership entirely. Systems no longer routed to Earth's president or defense secretary, they routed to him. And the first thing he did wasn't deploy ships, it was erase presence. Earth disappeared off the galactic grid in less than 7 hours. Entire battle networks retracted into encrypted subspace. Every forward satellite self-destructed on cue. Civilian vessels were rerouted under blackout cloaks, and for a short moment, Earth's enemies thought they'd fled, that humanity had blinked under pressure. But in truth, they were watching through new eyes, because Collier Riven's death was more than a loss, it was a transfer of control. Her sacrifice didn't just earn her a place in remembrance, it handed Earth's most dangerous strategist a blank check. The Dominion never even knew who they'd killed. Not really. They didn't hear about her dragging 6 wounded soldiers through an avalanche on Vorga, or the time she stepped into an active minefield to deactivate a Dominion trap with just a handheld med scanner and instinct. They didn't care, and that was their undoing, because Admiral Riven didn't just mourn, he recalculated the war, not for victory, for memory, for precision. The retaliation that followed wasn't fueled by rage, it was surgical. One Dominion weapons depot at a time, one relay point erased, one officer abducted and vanished, each event tied to someone who had signed off on the funeral attack. No fanfare, no slogans, just names, tracked and removed. The Admiral didn't need to declare war, he was already writing its conclusion, because Earth doesn't raise legends to win battles, it raises them to end them. And this time, the Dominion hadn't just targeted a healer, they had assassinated a lineage of command, one whose response was written in silence, buried deep in the bones of Earth's war code. And now that it had awakened, nothing could put it back to sleep, not until every hand that had signed her death or drew broken bar had been buried with the same cold ceremony they once mocked. The footage was never meant to be seen beyond Dominion borders, that was the plan. Film the slaughter, clip it for internal morale purposes, twist it into propaganda that framed the humans as sentimental fools, a weak, weeping over the dead in a war they were losing. The Dominion had done it before, in past conflicts. They'd controlled the narrative by controlling the lens, but this time, the lens betrayed them. Somewhere in the feed relay, a satellite transmission, maybe a hacked surveillance beacon, maybe something else entirely, a fragment of unedited footage escaped the firewall. It wasn't the Dominion's packaged version, not the slow-motion shots with sarcastic commentary or the dramatic music they'd added later. It was raw, a shaky cam feed from a human helmet, capturing every second of the burial, the execution, the stillness that followed. It showed a chaplain falling backward mid-prayer, it showed the medic reaching out one final time, and it showed, in haunting detail, the moment a grieving soldier closed his eyes, refused to scream, and kept digging the grave anyway. That clip traveled like wildfire through the neutral systems, carried not by hackers, not by activists, but by witnesses, civilian traitors, independent broadcasters, old friends of Earth with no orders, just a feeling in their gut that this had crossed a line even war wasn't allowed to step over. And that's when the galaxy changed sides. The Dominion hadn't expected the neutral powers to care. Why would they? For decades, neutrality had meant detachment, a trade over principle, survival over alliance. But this footage didn't feel like politics. It felt like desecration. It showed something sacred being destroyed with laughter. And even species that had once watched the war from a comfortable distance found themselves unsettled. On the aquatic world of Vari Prime, a broadcast council wept on air. On the hardened mining moon Cretan, soldiers laid down their arms for 1 hour of silence, not because they were allied with Earth. Most had fought against it, but because something in that image triggered a deeper code, one not written in treaties or shared currency, but in empathy. A medic murdered mid-ritual, a body left crumpled in the dust with no honor given. These weren't humans fighting for land or fuel, these were humans trying to say goodbye. And the galaxy watched them be silenced. Not everyone responded openly, not at first, but communications between neutral worlds shifted. Trade deals with the Dominion were postponed. Diplomatic shuttles were suddenly rerouted for safety. Behind closed doors, entire networks of observers began whispering the same thing: we're next if we stay quiet. Because if a treaty-bound funeral could be turned into a public spectacle, if the rules of war could be mocked in real time, then no one was safe. Not the neutral, not the small, not the slow to choose. And Earth, for all its military might, wasn't threatening anyone in those first few days. That was what made the fear so sharp. Earth hadn't said a word, but somehow a broken bar. The silence echoed louder than any Dominion anthem ever had. It became a force, and it pushed people away from the monsters who made mockery out of mourning. The Dominion tried to bury the leak. They threatened fines, pulled entire stations off the grid, even arrested several independent journalists. But it didn't matter. The footage couldn't be stopped, because it didn't spread by force. It spread by choice, by the quiet decision of beings who had seen too many wars, who understood too well the difference between casualties and cruelty. And what they saw in that video wasn't war, it was ritual murder, carried out against a culture that had shown restraint until the very end. Soon, silence began surrounding the Dominion, not Earth's silence, but the silence of old allies closing their gates, refusing to send fuel, halting access to refit docks, locking them out. The vital communication relays, systems once balanced on neutrality, tipped, ever so slightly, toward sympathy, not just for Earth, but for what Earth had lost. And in that slow gravitational pull, the Dominion finally began to feel the cold echo of their mistake. They'd thought killing the unarmed would fracture humanity. Instead, a broken bar, it united the galaxy's conscience, and they hadn't even seen what was coming yet. Because sympathy is not loyalty, and silence, a broken bar, is not forgiveness. They weren't supposed to survive. The squad on Kairos Eta, the burial team, the medics, the engineers turned grave diggers, had been marked for extermination, not by chance, but by design. The Dominion's entire strike was meant to wipe them out, and one flash of cruelty, erase the image of humans honoring their fallen so no one could use it as a symbol. But they miscalculated. A few survived, broken, shaken, some wounded so badly they couldn't stand when the smoke cleared. But they were alive, not because the Dominion failed, but because one soldier who had already laid 3 friends into the dirt had dragged another behind the gravestone and shielded him with his own body until the firing stopped. The footage didn't show that part. It cut off before the silence returned. But those who survived the broken bar, they remembered. And what came next didn't look like vengeance. It looked like purpose. The kind that burns cold and walks slow and knows exactly where to strike. In the days following the funeral, while Earth's official channels remained silent, that squad didn't wait. They moved. No longer on orders, no longer bound by uniforms or doctrine. They weren't a unit anymore. They were a vow. Each survivor carried a different piece of her memory, a Kali ribbed. The medic who died first, one of them had known her since childhood. Another had been saved by her 6 months prior. None of them knew she was the daughter of classified war strategist. None of them needed to. They only knew she was the best of them. And now, every step they took into enemy territory wasn't just a mission, it was an offering. They didn't tell command where they were going. They didn't ask for backup. They repurposed an old survey craft, rewired its signature to mimic Dominion wreckage, and jumped into enemy space with no comms, no support, no way out. What they did have a broken bar was a list, the names of every officer, technician, an operative involved in the Kairos 8 ambush, not rumor, fact, acquired through encrypted battlefield forensics and a single stolen Dominion command log that one of them downloaded mid-retreat. The list wasn't long, just enough to fill a grave. What followed over the next 11 days would later be known only in whispers, not official missions, not sanctioned strikes, just systems going quiet, outposts reporting unexplained breaches, Dominion officers disappearing mid-meeting, military databanks emptied of classified files without triggering any alerts. In each case, the only clue was left behind in silence, sometimes a personal item laid gently on a console, sometimes a single shovel, resting on the floor of an abandoned ship. And though Earth said nothing publicly, the pattern was unmistakable. The squad had become a message, a living warning. The ghost fleet of 7 souls who no longer wore names, only loss. And the galaxy began to take notice. In war, symbols are more powerful than fleets. Stories move faster than signals. The footage of the funeral had shown what humans lost, but the survivors showed what humans become when you desecrate their dead. They were no longer soldiers in the eyes of those watching from the shadows. They were myth, a myth with a trail of proof and no face attached. On neutral worlds, graffiti began appearing in Dominion-occupied slums, simple drawings of helmets lying atop folded flags. Refugees whispered about the gravediggers, a name the squad never chose, but never denied. Dominion commanders tried to suppress it, calling it fear propaganda. But fear has its own momentum. Soon, entire colonies began refusing to refuel Dominion patrols, not out of alliance with Earth, but out of quiet, growing dread. And on Earth, the silence held, not because they were absent, but because their vengeance was already in motion, carried by those who didn't need medals, didn't need orders, just reason. And they had the purest one of all. She didn't die for war. She died to protect the moment of peace, so they became war, so no one else would ever interrupt peace again. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were the beginning of something Earth never announced, never explained, never had to. A reckoning that wore no flag, and left only graves in its wake. And now, the only question left across Dominion space was whispered in corridors where fear outpaced command. What happens when the ones you fail to kill become the ones you can't find? And when they do find you a broken bar, will they let you speak before they bury you too?